The bedchamber was meant to be a sanctuary, but to Seren Vantrell, it felt like a beautifully decorated, inescapable tomb. She sat stiffly at the edge of the sprawling, feather-stuffed mattress, her unblinking gaze locked on the roaring hearth. The flames cast dancing, golden shadows across the heavy crimson velvet drapes and the polished obsidian floor, radiating a thick, suffocating warmth. It was a heat that stood in stark, almost mocking contrast to the eternal blizzard raging outside the frosted glass windows of Ironfall Keep. Every crackle of the burning logs seemed to amplify the crushing silence of the massive stone room, a silence that pressed against her ears until they rang. She had lived her entire life in the bitter, unforgiving cold of the outer provinces, accustomed to drafty wooden walls and threadbare blankets. This overwhelming heat, this opulent luxury, felt entirely foreign and profoundly dangerous. She had expected chains forged from rusted iron. She had expected the damp, biting cold of a subterranean dungeon, where her only company would be the dripping of dark water and the scurry of unseen vermin. Instead, she had been escorted to the highest tower of the fortress. She had been bathed in steaming, perfumed water, smelling of crushed cedar and sweet almond, her ragged, mud-stained clothes stripped away and replaced with a gown of spun silver silk. The fabric felt softer than a summer cloud against her battered, colloosed skin, yet the extreme luxury only sharpened her sense of absolute helplessness. No amount of opulence could disguise the reality of her captivity. She was a prisoner, a hostage handed over to the most feared ruler in the three realms. Seren raised her right arm, the wide silk sleeve falling back to reveal the undeniable proof of her surrender. The magical silver pact mark rested just below her wrist, a delicate, intricate lattice of metallic ink that had been magically seared into her flesh. It did not burn like a brand, nor did it ache like a physical wound. Instead, it pulsed, a steady, rhythmic throb that seemed to sync with a heavy, distant heartbeat that was not entirely her own. Every time she drew a breath, the silver lines shimmered with a faint, ghostly luminescence, acting as a constant, somatic reminder that her life no longer belonged to her. It belonged entirely to the Alpha King. She traced the raised, metallic edges of the mark with a trembling finger, her stomach twisting into a tight, agonizing knot. The plush comfort of the room did absolutely nothing to soothe the frantic, racing terror that had taken deep root in her chest. Her thoughts were consumed by one singular, desperate question, looping endlessly in her mind. Was her sister safe? Gemma Vantrell was only 16, fragile and incredibly gentle-hearted. The young girl possessed none of the quiet, stubborn resilience that Seren had been forced to forge over years of surviving on the harsh, impoverished fringes of the Lycan territories. When the guards had dragged them before the throne, Gemma had been so utterly terrified, shaking like a brittle autumn leaf caught in a winter gale. Her large, doe-like brown eyes had been wide with the horrific realization that they were going to be executed. Gemma had been arrested 3 days prior, dragged from their village by unfeeling sentries for a minor, desperate misunderstanding over a discarded loaf of bread in the lower markets. They had hauled her away, a terrified child weeping for her sister, and thrown her into the black, freezing depths of the keep's subterranean dungeons. Seren would not let her fragile sibling rot in the dark. She had risked absolutely everything, scaling the treacherous, ice-slicked cliffs at the edge of the fortress. She had slipped unnoticed past the heavily armed outer perimeter to infiltrate Ironfall Keep, determined to break her sister out of her icy cell. It was a foolish, desperate rescue mission, born of fierce maternal protectiveness and a naive belief that they could escape the heavily guarded fortress unseen. She had found Gemma. She had broken the heavy iron lock. They had almost made it back to the safety of the forest line, but they were caught inches from the iron gates by the elite royal guard. And suddenly, they were both facing the ultimate price. Seren had sacrificed everything to get her out of that icy throne room alive. She had traded her future, her freedom, and perhaps her very soul, all for the explicit promise that the younger girl would be escorted past the heavily fortified iron gates of the fortress and sent safely back to their village. But had the king kept his word? Could a monster truly be trusted to honor a bargain made with a lowly thief? The heavy silence of the bedchamber offered no answers. Earlier, 3 maids had brought her a tray of food that defied imagination. The roasted pheasant was glazed with rare winter berries, sitting beside a heavy crystal goblet of warm honeyed wine and a loaf of bread that still steamed in the cool air. It was a lavish feast that would have comfortably fed her and Gemma for a month in their draughty, leaking cabin. The sheer extravagance of it twisted her empty stomach into tight knots of guilt. How could she possibly eat when she didn't even know if her sister had a warm fire to sit by tonight? She had pushed the ornate silver tray away, the harsh clatter of heavy metal against the oak table echoing far too loudly in the quiet, oppressive room. The maids had not just brought food, they had scrubbed her clean. They had washed the grime of the lower village from her skin, untangled her long, dark hair until it shone like midnight silk, and cleaned the dirt from beneath her cracked fingernails. The only possession they had left untouched was the lunar crest amulet. The ancient silver medallion she kept hidden beneath her bodice rested cold and dormant against her collarbone. They had moved with the silent mechanical efficiency of ghosts, keeping their eyes lowered and refusing to acknowledge any of Seren's frantic, desperate questions. Their lips were sealed by an absolute, terrifying loyalty to their sovereign. The isolation was a deliberate tactic, a psychological pressure meant to disorient her and break her spirit. She felt like a fragile porcelain doll, polished and placed on a high, unreachable shelf, waiting for a master who could shatter her on a mere whim. Seren stood up abruptly, her bare feet sinking deep into the thick white pelt of a massive snow bear rug. She paced the length of the cavernous room, her movements sharp and restless, like a trapped animal testing the perimeter of its cage. The physical toll of her unaddressed anxiety was beginning to manifest aggressively. A phantom chill crept up her spine despite the intense, baking heat of the fireplace, and her lungs felt tight, as if the air itself had grown too thin to breathe. She walked to the massive arched window, pressing her palms flat against the freezing glass. The biting cold provided a momentary, grounding shock to her system, a sharp sensory contrast that anchored her spiraling thoughts. Below, the sprawling courtyard of Ironfall Keep was buried beneath a thick blanket of pristine, untouched snow. The towering granite walls loomed like the jagged teeth of a giant beast, impenetrable, hostile, and absolute. Beyond those walls lay the dense, unforgiving pine forest, shrouded in a swirling grey mist that obscured the horizon. Somewhere out there, her sister was braving the harsh elements, hopefully wrapped in the thick furs the king's guards had supposedly provided. Seren closed her eyes, pressing her warm forehead against the icy pane. She did not cry. She simply prayed fiercely to the silent, uncaring moon. Let her reach the village. Let this sacrifice mean something. As if in direct response to her profound emotional distress, the silver ink on her arm flared with a sudden, searing heat. Seren gasped, clutching her arm as a powerful surge of foreign sensation rushed violently through her veins. It was not pain, but a deep, overwhelming wave of heavy, authoritative calm. It was a sensation of absolute, territorial control, a psychic weight pressing down on her panic, attempting to smother her fear with an unnatural, suffocating blanket of security. She fought against it, her breath coming in ragged, defiant pants. She did not want his comfort. She did not want his ancient magic invading her mind. She ripped her hand away from her chest, staring down at the glowing silver lattice. She was an outcast, a woman with no pack, no status, and no wealth. She was nothing to a ruler of his magnitude, and yet he had looked at her with eyes like a fracturing glacier, bypassed every logical demand of a conqueror, and bound her to his side with ancient magic. Why hadn't he just killed them both and been done with it? No woman lasted a night with him. They had whispered in the dark corners of the taverns. The Alpha King of Valdris was a creature of ice and death, a man who left a trail of frozen corpses and shattered kingdoms in his wake. They said his cruelty was as boundless as the northern winter. But one woman did. One woman lasted a lifetime. The old, half-forgotten tales of fated mates and ancient bloodlines suddenly felt dangerously close, whispering from the darkest corners of her memory, though she violently shoved the impossible thought away. Seren wrapped her arms tightly around herself, feeling incredibly small and terribly exposed despite the layers of heavy silk. The bond on her wrist continued to throb, a steady, relentless drumbeat that promised she would never truly be alone again. She turned away from the window, her gaze falling on the massive, intricately carved oak door that locked her inside. She was physically safe, she was warm, and she was entirely at his mercy. And as the hours stretched into the long, dark night, while she waited in agonizing suspense for word of her sister's departure, the memory of how she had arrived in this gilded cage played behind her eyes, sharp and agonizing as a shattered mirror. The throbbing in her pulse was an unforgiving anchor, dragging Seren forcefully backward, in time to the sheer terror of the previous morning. The transition from the warm, opulent isolation of her current bedchamber to the freezing, cavernous depths of her memory was instantaneous, hitting her with the breath-stealing force of a physical blow. 24 hours ago, there had been no silver silk gowns or roaring hearths. There had only been the biting, merciless cold of the throne room. She could still vividly feel the rough, unyielding grip of the armored guards who had dragged her and Gemma across the threshold of the great hall. The guards wore thick cloaks of black bear fur draped over their heavy steel plates, their faces completely hidden behind iron visors that made them look more like unfeeling golems than living lichens. The floor had been crafted from raw, unpolished granite, slick with a perpetual layer of creeping, magical frost. The ice immediately seeped through the threadbare knees of Seren's woolen trousers as she was forced down, biting into her skin like a swarm of angry, freezing wasps. Every step they had taken echoed like a death knell in the massive, vaulted space. The air inside the throne room was so aggressively cold that it burned the back of her throat with every inhalation, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of ozone, polished steel, and ancient, dormant magic. Massive pillars of dark stone stretched up toward a ceiling lost in shadows, while heavy iron braziers burned with a strange, blue-tinted flame that offered no physical warmth, only an eerie, spectral illumination. Gemma had been sobbing uncontrollably, her small, frail body trembling violently, as she clung desperately to her sister's tattered wool cloak. The younger girl's knees had completely given out halfway across the hall, and she had collapsed onto the freezing stone, her bruised fingers digging deeply into Seren's arm. Seren had immediately thrown herself down onto the ice-slicked floor, wrapping her arms protectively around Gemma's shaking shoulders. She had kept her head bowed, her vision restricted to the frost-covered stone and the heavy, steel-toed boots of the elite guards surrounding them. But even without looking up, she could physically feel the presence of the man seated at the far end of the hall. The sheer, overwhelming aura of the Alpha King pressed down on them like a physical weight. It was an atmosphere of absolute, terrifying dominance, a suffocating pressure that made her lungs constrict and her primal instincts scream to submit, to flee, to hide. Treason and a dungeon breach within the walls of Ironfall Keep, a voice had echoed, bouncing off the icy walls with clinical detachment. It was not the king who spoke, but a seneschal standing by the dais, his tone dripping with bored disdain. The punishment is absolute death. Gemma had let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail, burying her tear-streaked face against Seren's neck. The sound of her absolute despair had triggered something fierce and uncontrollable within Seren's chest. The quiet, observant restraint she had relied on for survival, her entire life shattered in an instant. She did not complain about the unfairness of their world. She did not beg for the mercy of the ancestors. Instead, she acted with the reckless, terrifying courage of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Seren had ripped herself away from the guard's peripheral hold, throwing herself forward until her knees struck the base of the elevated dais. She threw her head back, finally looking upon Calin Vance. He was a colossal, deeply intimidating figure, slouched upon a throne carved from a single, massive block of glacial ice that seemed immune to melting. He wore armor of blackened steel, and a heavy cloak of rare dire wolf fur spilled over his broad, tense shoulders. Heavy physical restraints forged from enchanted glacial ice, known throughout the realms as the frost-cold chain, were draped heavily over the arms of the throne. These mystical, freezing chains were designed to bind and suppress the volatile edges of his immense destructive magic, clinking softly with every minimal movement he made. But it was his face that stole the breath straight from her lungs. He possessed a brutal, aristocratic beauty, all sharp, unforgiving angles and cold, rigid lines that looked as if they had been chiseled by the winter wind itself. His eyes were the exact color of a violent winter storm, a piercing, devastating grey that seemed to look right through her flesh and straight into the marrow of her bones. A faint, deadly mist of frost seemed to curl outward from his bare fingertips, a visible, terrifying manifestation of the elemental curse that ravaged his ancient bloodline. "Spare her," Seren had gasped, her voice raw, desperate, and echoing in the completely silent hall. "Please, she is just a child. She had absolutely no part in the infiltration. It was my plan, my crime alone. I broke into the dungeon. I dragged her out." The Alpha King did not move. His piercing, frost-bound gaze remained fixed on her, completely unreadable, a wall of pure ice. "I beg of you," she continued, her voice breaking as she pressed her bare palms flat against the freezing, unforgiving stone. "Take me, execute me, punish me however you see fit. But let her go. I offer my life for hers." For a long, excruciating moment, the throne room was so utterly silent that Seren could hear the frantic, rabbit-fast beating of her own heart. Then the king leaned forward. As he shifted, a sudden, violent change swept through the hall. The Calin inhaled sharply, his broad chest expanding, and the exact moment he caught her unique scent, his entire demeanor fractured. The cold, bored indifference vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of absolute, visceral shock. His stormy eyes flared, shifting for a fraction of a second into a burning, molten gold. A low, guttural growl rumbled up from deep within his chest, a sound so purely animalistic, so terrifyingly possessive that the seasoned, armored guards instinctively took a step back, their hands dropping to their hilts in confusion. He did not order her execution. He did not call for the executioner's blade. Instead, he stood up, his massive frame towering ominously over the dais. The assembled courtiers, dressed in their fine, immaculate velvets and rich furs, held their collective breath in stunned silence. The only sound in the vast hall was the heavy, rhythmic thud of the king's steel-toed boots against the stone, each step echoing like the slow, deliberate strike of a war drum. He descended the ice-carved steps, slowly, deliberately, his burning eyes never once leaving her face. With every step he took, the bitter cold in the room seemed to violently waver, clashing against a sudden, inexplicable rush of phantom warmth that bloomed deep within Seren's chest. It was a somatic sensation of ancient fire meeting cursed ice, a cosmic collision that made her skin prickle and her breath catch in her throat. The dormant solar energy hidden in her bloodline stirred, rising to meet the devastating chill of his aura. He stopped mere inches from where she knelt on the hard stone. The sheer physical size of him was overwhelming. When he spoke, his voice was not a shout, but a low, dangerous murmur that vibrated straight through the stone and into her bones. "You offer your life," he said, his tone incredibly soft, completely at odds with his terrifying, blood-soaked reputation. "But death is a waste of a perfectly good asset." Seren stared up at him, her chest heaving, entirely unable to comprehend the sudden, dramatic shift in the atmosphere. The king's gaze dropped to her trembling, calloused hands, then traced the defiant, terrified set of her jaw. Something profoundly tragic and desperately hungry flashed in his eyes before he forcefully masked it behind a thick wall of icy, royal authority. "I will spare the child," Kaelin declared, his voice carrying just enough absolute command to reach the farthest corners of the hall. "She will be given provisions and escorted safely past the perimeter immediately. But you will not die today, little thief. We are going to strike a different bargain." "What bargain?" Seren whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring pulse in her ears. "The Obsidian Treaty," he replied flatly, invoking an ancient unbreakable law, a binding pact of exchange. "You will remain within the walls of Ironfall Keep, not in the dungeons, and not as a lowly slave. You will reside in my personal quarters as my companion. You will belong to this fortress and to me until I decide otherwise. Your sister walks free the very moment you accept the mark." It was a preposterous, maddening demand. It made absolutely no political or logical sense. Why would a supreme sovereign ruler invite a destitute, nameless thief into his most private sanctum? But the feral, unspoken intensity in his eyes told her there was absolutely no room for negotiation. He was not asking a question. He was backing her into the only choice she could possibly make to ensure her sister's survival. "I accept," she had breathed, the words tumbling out without a second thought. The king had reached out, his massive, scarred hand wrapping firmly around her small, fragile wrist. The precise moment his skin touched hers, a physical shockwave of somatic energy had blasted through the room. His fingers were freezing, painfully cold from the ice curse, yet beneath that terrifying frost, Seren felt an ancient, desperate, burning pulse. He had pressed a silver signet ring against her erratic pulse point, and the ancient magic had seared itself instantly into her flesh, binding her fate to the frozen beast of the north. Now, jolted entirely back to the present and sitting completely alone in the luxurious, suffocating silence of her royal bedchamber, Seren rubbed her marked wrist. The vivid memory of the previous day slowly faded back into the shadows of the room. The deal was struck, but she was still waiting to see the final proof. She had successfully survived the executioner's block to save her sister, but as the intricate silver lines pulsed warmly against her skin, she realized with a cold, sinking stab of dread that surviving the Alpha King's undivided attention might prove far more dangerous than facing his blade. The heavy iron latch of the bedchamber door groaned, a sharp screech that suddenly shattered the oppressive silence. Seren spun around, her bare feet sinking into the thick snow-bare rug as her defensive instincts flared. Standing in the threshold was Devon Mercer, the stoic guard commander of the fortress. He did not wear the cruel expression she had expected from a Lycan officer sent to collect a prisoner. His scarred face remained a mask of rigid military discipline. "It is time," Devon stated. His voice was a gravelly rumble echoing against the obsidian floor, carrying absolute authority. "The king commands that you witness the fulfillment of your bargain today. Follow me." He did not offer chains. He simply turned back into the freezing corridor, expecting her absolute compliance. Seren swallowed hard, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She pulled a heavy crimson shawl tightly over her spun silver silk gown, bracing herself for whatever torment awaited, and followed the imposing guard. The walk through Ironfall Keep was an agonizing exercise in silent endurance. They climbed a winding spiral staircase, carved directly from the mountain. Narrow arrow slits allowed razor-sharp slivers of pale winter light to slice through the gloom. With every upward step, the ambient temperature plummeted. Yet, amidst the freezing air, the intricate silver lattice seared into her right wrist throbbed. It pulsed with a steady, phantom warmth, a somatic anchor, reminding her that the Alpha's magic continuously tracked her movements. Devon pushed open a heavy oak door, leading them out onto the exposed battlements. The violent northern wind tore tore at her, whipping her dark hair and biting into her skin. Seren gasped, rushing forward to press her coal-used palms flat against the ice-slicked parapet, her desperate gaze sweeping the sprawling courtyard below. Positioned perfectly near the massive iron gates was a sturdy wooden carriage. The muscular draft horses exhaled thick plumes of white vapor into the freezing air, draped in thick leather barding, bearing the Ironfall keep crest, and standing directly beside the open carriage door was Gemma. The fragile girl was swallowed up by layers of heavy grey rabbit furs. 2 elite sentries stood nearby, gently handing the terrified teenager a heavy, leather-bound satchel. Even from the staggering height, Seren could hear the heavy clinking of royal gold coins. They were giving her provisions, immense wealth, and secure transport back to the southern borders. Tears blurred Seren's vision. "We are small things in a world of teeth," she had whispered to her sister years ago. "Smallness is a gift. Use it." She prayed silently that Gemma would use this unearned freedom to disappear into the quiet anonymity of distant villages. Down in the courtyard, Gemma paused with her foot on the carriage step. She turned her head, wide eyes scanning the towering black spires, searching for the sister who had traded her own life to secure this departure. Seren leaned dangerously far over the stone, knuckles bone-white. She wanted to scream her sister's name, but her throat was locked tight by a crushing wave of grief. Gemma wiped a tear, clutching the satchel, and climbed into the carriage. The driver cracked a whip, and the iron gates groaned open. Seren forced herself to watch as the carriage rolled slowly into the swirling grey mist of the pine forest, disappearing entirely. The gates slammed shut. The heavy iron locking bar fell into place, with a resounding boom reverberating through the soles of Seren's bare feet. It was done. The impossible rescue mission had concluded. Her sister was safe, and Seren was permanently trapped. A profound emptiness settled deep inside her chest, immediately countered by the aggressive, burning pulse of the mark on her wrist. She slowly stepped back from the ledge, trembling violently from adrenaline, freezing wind, and devastating finality. She turned to face the guard commander, expecting his stoic demeanor to crack into a cruel smirk. The leverage was gone. There was absolutely no reason for the royal court to pretend they were offering her hospitality anymore. "Where are the chains, Commander?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You can take me down to the holding cells now. The performance is over." Devon stared at her, dark eyes narrowing in genuine confusion. He stepped forward, raising his fur-lined cloak to shield her from the brutal crosswind. "You are no prisoner of the damp dark, lady," the stoic Lycan replied, his tone laced with a quiet respect. "The king honors his bargains to the exact letter of the law. You are bound by the Obsidian Treaty. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with. I am to guide you directly to your quarters in the upper halls." Her breath hitched. The quiet, dignified compliance she had carefully constructed wavered dangerously. She had fully expected brutality, cold stone, and endless isolation. Being escorted into the most intimate, heavily guarded private wing of the sovereign's domain was a terrifying prospect defying all logic. She gave a stiff, jerky nod, wrapping her arms tightly around her waist as she followed the imposing warrior back into the relative warmth of the stone stairwell. When Devon finally left her alone, the heavy oak door of her bedchamber clicking shut with absolute finality, the true weight of her new reality crashed down. The roaring hearth did absolutely nothing to chase away the deep, bone-biting chill that had followed her up from the battlements. She sank onto the edge of the sprawling mattress, staring blankly at the dancing flames as the suffocating silence of the gilded cage wrapped around her like a physical shroud. That quiet, creeping coldness would become her only companion as the long, empty days slowly bled into one another. 1 month passed, 30 agonizing, isolated days locked within the opulent confines of her high-tower suite. Seren barely saw a living soul besides the silent servants who delivered her meals. But even in her quiet exile, she could feel the fortress actively deteriorating around her. The ambient temperature of Ironfall Keep dropped steadily with each passing day, jagged frost creeping up the inside of her lavish bedroom windows like grasping, icy fingers. The magical lattice on her wrist pulsed with an increasingly erratic, freezing ache that directly mirrored the castle's rapid decay. Worse were the nights. In the dead, suffocating silence of the midnight hours, she could hear it echoing through the massive stone walls, a deep, agonizing, and absolutely feral growl. It was the haunting sound of a beast being slowly, mercilessly torn apart from the inside out. The Alpha's elemental ice curse was rapidly accelerating, and the entire kingdom was freezing to death alongside him. On the 31st night, the suffocating silence of her quarters was suddenly shattered by a frantic, heavy pounding at her chamber door. Devon threw the heavy oak open without waiting for permission. The stoic commander looked completely haggard, his heavy armor hastily fastened and his breath pluming white in the freezing air of the corridor. "The king's condition has grown critical," Devon commanded, his voice tight with barely suppressed, raw panic. "The sovereign is failing. Come with me immediately." He did not offer further explanations as he turned sharply on his heel. Seren's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She practically ran to keep up with his hurried strides as they descended rapidly away from the high towers. They moved steadily through a series of increasingly opulent, restricted corridors. The raw, jagged granite of the outer walls gradually gave way to polished marble and intricately woven tapestries depicting ancient, forgotten battles. The air grew significantly warmer here, carrying the heavy, intoxicating scent of melting beeswax, dried sage, and the sharp, distinctive tang of dormant ozone. Devon finally stopped before a set of towering double doors carved from ancient mahogany and heavily reinforced with gleaming brass fittings. He did not knock. He simply pushed the heavy slabs of wood open and stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter alone. Seren stepped hesitantly over the threshold, her bare feet instantly registering the plush warmth of an imported woven rug. The doors clicked shut behind her with absolute finality, sealing her inside the Alpha King's private library. The sheer, impossible scale of the room stole the breath straight from her lungs. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, carved from dark oak, stretched endlessly upward, completely packed with leather-bound volumes, ancient scrolls, and glowing glass artifacts. Massive arched windows lined the western wall, offering a sweeping panoramic view of the frozen mountain peaks. A gargantuan stone hearth dominated the center of the far wall, roaring with a massive fire that aggressively fought back the encroaching chill of the massive space. Yet, despite the roaring flames, the ambient temperature in the center of the room was terrifyingly cold. Seated in a high-backed leather chair facing the hearth was Kalin. However, he was not the terrifying, unyielding conqueror who had commanded absolute dominance in the throne room a month ago. The sovereign was physically collapsing, his massive, broad-shouldered frame slumped heavily against the dark leather. Standing urgently beside the cursed ruler was an older man with deep, exhausted lines etched into his face. Dr. Orson Cole, the royal healer, wore a heavy leather apron stained with dark, crushed herbs and strange chemical burns. He was frantically grinding a glowing, luminescent root in a heavy iron mortar, his hands moving with desperate, practiced precision. Seren froze, her presence going entirely unnoticed by the suffering king. Kalin's breathing was incredibly shallow and ragged, each exhalation forming a thick, visible cloud of white mist in the air. The agonizing elemental ice curse was highly active, ravaging his ancient bloodline from the inside out. Thick, jagged layers of magical frost crawled aggressively up the side of his strong neck, turning the prominent veins beneath his pale skin a horrifying, bruised shade of black and blue. Draped heavily over his broad shoulders was the frost-cold chain. The mystical, freezing restraints were completely coated in a thick layer of rime, clinking softly as violent, uncontrollable shivers racked the king's massive frame. The chains were designed to suppress his volatile magic, but they appeared to be doing absolutely nothing to stop the creeping rot of the ancestral curse that was actively freezing his heart. Orson poured a vial of clear liquid into his iron mortar, and the mixture instantly flared into a viscous, glowing golden liquid, the Sunborn Elixir. It was a rare, incredibly volatile potion designed solely to temporarily beat back the lethal chill. The healer finally glanced up, his tired eyes locking onto Saren's small, hesitant figure standing near the entrance. He did not look surprised by her sudden arrival. Rather, he looked incredibly relieved to have an extra pair of hands. "Don't just stand there trembling, girl," Orson commanded, his voice lacking military harshness, but carrying the sharp, undeniable urgency of a seasoned medical professional. The ambient magic is dropping his core temperature too fast. His heart is struggling to push frozen blood through his veins. I need the reference text immediately. Saren blinked, completely overwhelmed by the chaotic, highly technical medical crisis unfolding before her. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackle of the hearth. "The book," the royal healer grunted, gesturing sharply with a blood-stained finger toward an ornate reading stand positioned just a few feet away. "The ancient grimoire, the massive one bound in rough, black worm scale. Bring it to me right now. My hands are completely coated in the elixir, and if this liquid touches the cursed parchment, it will burn the entire library down." Saren hesitated for a fraction of a second, her ingrained suspicion battling violently against the undeniable, visceral agony radiating from the dying king. She swallowed her fear, forcing her trembling legs to move. She approached the reading stand, her calloused hands wrapping firmly around the thick, freezing edges of the grimoire. The massive book was astonishingly heavy, smelling faintly of centuries of trapped dust and metallic copper. She carried the heavy text across the thick rug, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she approached the epicenter of the freezing aura. The closer she got to Callin, the more the air felt like thousands of tiny, invisible needles pricking her exposed skin. The absolute misery of his condition was staggering. As she stepped directly up to the leather chair, Callin's heavy eyelids fluttered open. His pale, tempest-hued eyes were deeply clouded, with agonizing pain, looking sunken and hollow, yet they still managed to project a terrifying, possessive intensity the moment they locked onto her face. A low, rumbling growl vibrated deep within his chest, a sound not of threat, but of a desperately wounded animal recognizing the only source of safety in the room. "Here," Saren breathed, extending the heavy black book toward the healer. But it was not Orson who reached for it. Callin lifted his right arm with agonizing slowness. His entire forearm and hand were completely encased in a thick, jagged gauntlet of lethal glacial frost. The ice was so solid it looked like carved diamond, radiating a cold so profound it actually burned the air around it. He did not reach for the heavy spine of the text. His clouded, desperate eyes remained fixed entirely on her face as his freezing, ice-covered knuckles reached blindly out. Saren tried to pull the book back, but the sheer weight of the tome made her clumsy. Her bare, coil-used fingers accidentally brushed against the jagged, freezing ice encasing the back of his hand. Boom! The physical collision of their skin triggered an instantaneous, violent sensory explosion that completely defied all logic. The metallic signet burned into her flesh, flared with the blinding, searing intensity of a branding iron straight from a forge. A sudden, massive surge of absolute, blinding solar warmth, the deeply suppressed, dormant sunborn magic hidden in her bloodline, erupted violently from the very center of her chest. It rushed down her arm like a river of molten gold, bypassing the heavy book entirely and passing directly into Callin's freezing flesh. The chemical and magical reaction was devastatingly immediate. The solid, impenetrable armor of glacial ice encasing his arm cracked with a deafening, high-pitched screech that sounded exactly like a massive mirror shattering in a silent room. Deep, glowing fissures of bright, golden light tore aggressively through the dark frost. In less than a second, the lethal ice completely dissolved, shattering into thousands of microscopic, shimmering shards that vaporized into a thick, hissing cloud of white steam before they could even hit the polished floor. Kaelin gasped, a raw, ragged sound of absolute, breath-stealing shock that echoed violently through the cavernous library. The violent, uncontrollable shivering racking his massive frame ceased instantly. His storm-grey eyes widened, the cloudy haze of agonizing pain vanishing entirely as his irises shifted instantly into a burning, brilliant and molten gold. The beast within him had recognized its fated mate, and the lethal curse had just met its absolute ancient antithesis. The crippling pain of the ice was gone, replaced by an impossible, soothing wave of radiant warmth that sank straight into his freezing bones. He stared at her hand, his chest heaving with deep, greedy breaths of air, completely unable to process the impossible miracle that had just flowed from her delicate, trembling fingers. A sharp, distinct shattering sound broke the stunned silence. Orson had dropped the heavy iron mortar in sheer, unadulterated shock. The glowing sunborn elixir spilled uselessly across the rug, utterly forgotten, as the healer stared at the lowly, outcast girl who had just shattered a generational curse with a single, accidental touch. The grand dining hall of Ironfall Keep was an amphitheater of whispered judgments and razor-sharp court politics. 2 evenings after the impossible miracle in the library, the royal court had been summoned for a formal winter banquet. Since Ventrell sat rigidly in a high-backed velvet chair near the head of the massive mahogany table, her presence an absolute anomaly that the elite Lycan aristocracy simply refused to accept. She kept her gaze fixed on the polished obsidian plates, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their violent trembling. The ambient temperature of the cavernous hall was stifling, heated by towering fireplaces that roared with unnatural, blue-tinted flames, yet a profound social coldness pressed heavily against her skin. The pack elites dined on rich roasted venison and glazed root vegetables, their sharp canines catching the firelight as they cast predatory, sidelong glances at the quiet, dark-haired girl who had inexplicably been elevated to the sovereign's side. Every clink of crystal and scrape of silver felt magnified in the tense, oppressive atmosphere. The delicate spun silver gown they had dressed her in felt like a beautiful, glittering target painted directly onto her back. It was a garment woven for a queen, not for a girl who had spent her life scavenging in the southern fringes to keep her sister fed. Beneath the long silken sleeve, the enchanted silver lattice pulsed with a steady, rhythmic throb, feeding her somatic waves of the Alpha King's dark, brooding presence seated just inches to her left. Kaelin Vance was a terrifying statue of blackened steel and glacial authority, his steely, overcast gaze scanning the long table with a bored, lethal indifference that kept the aggressive nobles firmly in line. The sheer proximity to his massive frame sent tiny electric shocks of awareness skittering across her skin, a physical reminder of the obsidian treaty that bound her to this fortress. But his terrifying presence offered little comfort against the venomous aristocratic circles quietly plotting across the room, waiting for any sign of weakness. The heavy double doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a dramatic, echoing thud that abruptly silenced the overlapping conversations. Rowena Thorne glided into the banquet, her entrance deliberately timed to command maximum attention. The scheming, dynastic matriarch, who had long sought to exploit the king's failing health to seize total control of the Northern Territory, wore an exquisite gown of deep crimson silk that trailed across the stone floor like freshly spilled blood. She carried a sweet, practiced smile on her perfectly painted lips, an expression that entirely contradicted the toxic, calculating ambition burning in her dark eyes. As she approached the head of the table, The scent of sweet gardenia rolled off her, thick and cloying, yet beneath the heavy floral perfume lay a distinct, unsettling olfactory undertone of metallic rot. It was the scent of a predator hiding its true decay behind a mask of exquisite high-status luxury. "My king," Rowena purred, dipping into a flawless, deeply calculated curtsy before taking the empty seat directly across from the outcast. "It is an absolute honor to share the winter solstice feast with the crown. The keep feels remarkably lively tonight, despite the bitter winds howling outside our walls." Callan did not return the pleasantry. He merely offered a slow, glacial incline of his head, his massive shoulders tense beneath his heavy fur cloak. The frost-cold chains draped over his armor clinked softly, gleaming like captured starlight in the flickering firelight. The enchanted glacial ice of the heavy physical restraints normally suppressed worst the wood of his elemental condition, acting as a magical dampener, but tonight, the raw, violent cold radiating from his imposing form felt dangerously volatile. The noblewoman's dark, calculating eyes immediately shifted to the quiet girl sitting beside the sovereign. The sweet smile on the matriarch's face sharpened into a wicked, invisible blade. She reached across the polished mahogany, her slender, jewel-encrusted fingers wrapping elegantly around a heavy, ornate silver chalice filled with dark winterberry wine. With a fluid, mocking grace, she pushed the metal vessel directly toward the center of the table, offering a toast that was nothing more than a thinly veiled execution of character designed to publicly humiliate her rival. "And a toast to our sovereign's mysterious new companion," the noblewoman announced, her voice carrying a deceptive, honeyed warmth that easily reached the farthest corners of the silent dining hall. "Though, one must admit it is quite tragic to see a creature with such stagnant, fragile human blood sitting among true wolves. Tell me, little stray, does your broken lineage even know how to howl? Or do you merely cower in silence when the true predators of this keep decide to speak?" The dining hall plunged into an absolute, breathless silence. The sheer audacity of the insult hung in the thick air like a poised guillotine, sharp and inescapable. Seren felt the blood drain entirely from her face, her stomach twisting into a painful knot. The agonizing humiliation of a lifetime, spent as an invisible, destitute pariah, rushed back with the force of a physical blow. Her survival instincts screamed at her to bow her head, to apologize for taking up space, to shrink back into the safe, unnoticed shadows where she had spent her entire youth protecting Gemma. She stared down at the dark wine rippling inside the ornate cup, her chest tightening as a familiar, desolate despair threatened to swallow her whole. But before she could even draw a breath to reply, the ambient temperature in the massive hall violently plummeted, dropping so fast that the very air seemed to crack. The sudden, aggressive drop in heat was not a natural winter draft. It was a lethal, localized manifestation of pure, unadulterated elemental fury. The roaring blue flames in the towering hearths instantly dimmed, flickering wildly as a thick layer of jagged, magical frost exploded across the polished mahogany table. The ice shot outward from the sovereign's hands, like crawling white lightning, freezing the fine china, the silver platters, and the crystal goblets of the surrounding nobles in a matter of seconds. The lethal frost raced directly toward the crimson-clad matriarch, stopping mere inches from Seren's plate in a terrifying display of absolute, targeted control. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He simply reached out and took the ornate cup that the noblewoman had just pushed across the wood. His usually pale irises had darkened into a terrifying, endless black abyss. The moment his freezing, scarred fingers closed around the stem of the metal vessel, the dark winterberry wine inside flash-froze into solid ice. The metal groaned in agonizing protest before shattering completely, exploding into 100 glittering, frozen shards that rained down upon the expensive plates like broken diamonds. "You mistake her quiet restraint for a lack of strength, Rowena," the Alpha King murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that shook the very marrow of every lichen in the room, resonating with ancestral authority. "And you mistake my silence for tolerance." The dynastic matriarch flinched violently, her practiced smile collapsing entirely as the lethal frost crept dangerously close to her jeweled fingers. The entire court held their collective breath, completely paralyzed by the sheer, suffocating dominance radiating from the cursed beast of the north. "She is bound to me by the ancient laws of exchange," he continued, his tone devoid of any emotion save for a terrifying absolute territorial protection. "She sits at my right hand, under my absolute unquestionable protection. If any member of this court speaks of her lineage with disrespect again, I will not bother with the dungeon. I will personally freeze the air in your lungs until your very blood turns to winter." The absolute finality of his vow left zero room for redemption or debate. The scheming noblewoman bowed her head instantly, her face pale with genuine, visceral terror as the sweet scent of gardenia was entirely swallowed by the sharp tang of ozone and ice. "Forgive me, my king. I meant no disrespect to your companion." He ignored the desperate apology entirely. He turned his massive, imposing frame slightly toward the quiet girl beside him. In a stark, dizzying contrast to the brutal, freezing violence he had just directed at the court, his presence softened the instant his gaze fell upon her face. The terrifying black abyss in his eyes receded, replaced by a deep, agonizing yearning that he quickly masked. He did not reach out to touch her, respecting the strict spatial boundaries she desperately needed to feel safe, but the somatic heat of the ancient seal on her arm flared with a sudden, overwhelming wave of protective warmth. It was a silent, unbreakable promise communicating directly to her blood. As long as she sat beside him, no one in the three realms would ever be allowed to make her feel small again. The transition from the hostile, freezing glare of the dining hall to the quiet, dusty warmth of the royal healer's study felt like stepping into an entirely different world. Late the following afternoon, Seren found herself hidden away in the cavernous upper library, surrounded by towering shelves of ancient, leather-bound history. The golden light of the waning winter sun spilled through the arched glass windows, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes in the perfectly still air. Here, far away from the manipulative courtiers and the crushing weight of pack politics, she could finally breathe freely. She stood at a heavy oak reading table, leaning over a massive, incredibly old manuscript. Dr. Orson Cole stood beside her, his exhausted, lined face illuminated by the soft glow of a nearby candle that smelled of melting beeswax. Between them rested the ancient grimoire. The heavy leather tome smelled strongly of dried sage, old blood, and cracked parchment, its fragile pages containing the darkest, most closely guarded secrets of the Valdris bloodline. For hours, they had been desperately searching for a concrete explanation regarding the impossible miracle that had occurred during his medical crisis, when her mere touch had temporarily banished the agonizing frost. The outcast carefully turned a brittle page, her calloused fingers tracing the faded, intricate anatomical drawings of a lichen heart being consumed by jagged black ice. The text was written in an archaic, looping script that she struggled to decipher, but the older man navigated the ancient dialect with grim familiarity. The meticulous illustrations showed the curse not just as a physical affliction, but as a living, hungry void that sought to devour the host's innate magic entirely. The magical silver-packed mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be, the royal healer explained softly, his blood-stained finger tapping a faded illustration of a solar eclipse positioned directly above a frozen wolf. The elemental ice curse is not a standard illness, it is a generational magical deficit. It actively freezes the host from the inside out, because the body is desperately trying to regulate a massive void of cosmic energy. It searches endlessly for a warmth it cannot independently generate. She frowned, the intricate silver lattice of the binding glyph pulsing with a dull, rhythmic ache as she absorbed the horrifying mechanics of his suffering. But when I touched him, the ice completely shattered. I don't possess any magic, Dr. Cole. I am just a commoner from the southern fringes. My family has never shown any affinity for elemental power. Orson sighed heavily, adjusting his spectacles as he looked up at the dark-haired girl with a mixture of profound awe and deep sorrow. You are wrong. The explosive solar warmth that transferred from your skin to his was not an accident, nor was it a simple reaction to the treaty. The ancient manuscript is explicitly clear. Only a fated mate, carrying the dormant supreme magic of the sunborn lineage, can counterbalance the winter rot. The heat inside you is the only thing keeping him tethered to the living world. The revelation hit her with the crushing weight of a falling mountain. She stared down at the ancient text, her mind spinning wildly as the pieces violently snapped together. A fated mate. The stories she had grown up hearing in the drafty taverns of her youth were not just romantic myths designed to entertain children or ensure pack loyalty. They were a biological, cosmic reality. The terrifying, violent sovereign who had threatened her life to save her sister was the exact other half of her soul. The arcane binding on her forearm was not merely a symbol of her physical captivity. It was the physical manifestation of a bond forged by the stars themselves. I must check the herbal tinctures in the lower apse, the older man murmured, recognizing the sheer emotional overload violently crashing through her system. He knew she needed time to process the sheer scale of this discovery. Take your time with the text. The truth cannot be unread, child. With a respectful bow of his head, the healer gathered his iron mortar and quietly slipped out of the study, the heavy wooden door clicking softly shut behind him. She was left entirely alone with the devastating reality of her hidden divine lineage and the monumental responsibility it carried. She pressed her palms flat against the rough wood of the table, her breath coming in shallow, erratic gasps. No woman lasted a night with him. They had whispered in the shadows of the lower markets. But one woman did. One woman lasted a lifetime. The dramatic irony of her situation was almost too heavy to bear. She had offered her life in a desperate, sacrificial bargain to protect Gemma, fully believing she was trading her freedom to a ruthless monster who would eventually destroy her. Instead, she had walked directly into the arms of a desperate, dying man who had been unknowingly waiting for her soul for a century. You should not be reading that. The low, gravelly voice sent a sudden electric shock straight up her spine. Seren gasped, spinning around to face the shadows near the towering bookshelves. Kalen stepped slowly into the golden light of the setting sun. He looked incredibly tired, his broad shoulders stripped of the heavy black armor and thick furs he usually wore to project his fearsome authority across the kingdom. Dressed only in a simple linen shirt and dark trousers, the massive sovereign looked undeniably vulnerable, like a warrior who had finally laid down his sword. The frost-cold chains were entirely missing from his wrists, a testament to the temporary, miraculous relief her accidental touch had granted him. He did not advance toward her. He remained firmly rooted near the doorway, keeping a strict, respectful distance that honored the boundaries she had silently erected since arriving at the keep. His brooding, thunderous gaze traced the contours of her face with a heavy, melancholic intensity that made her pulse race furiously against her throat. The somatic hum between them was palpable, pulling at the invisible tether, binding their souls together with an agonizing, magnetic force. She clutched the edge of the reading table, her knuckles turning bone white as she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Is it true?" she whispered, her voice trembling but surprisingly resolute in the quiet room. "The text claims that the curse punishes verbal intimacy, that you forced the entire court away, that you built a reputation of cold, unfeeling cruelty just to keep people from getting close enough to freeze." He looked away, his jaw tightening as a muscle feathered in his cheek. The terrifying conqueror, commander of 10,000 wolves, looked completely broken by the weight of his own terrible legend. "The ice requires fuel," he murmured, his voice thick with internalized guilt and an exhaustion that ran deeper than bone. "If I allowed anyone to truly care for me, if I allowed myself to feel the warmth of my pack, the curse would drain their life force to sustain my own. I chose to be a tyrant in the light, so they would not have to die in the dark." The sheer altruistic tragedy of his confession shattered the last remaining wall of ice around her heart. She stepped away from the heavy leather tome, closing the physical distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. For the first time since she had infiltrated the fortress to save her sister, she did not look at him with terror. She looked at him with deep, profound understanding. The cold, unfeeling monster the world feared was nothing but a desperately lonely man sacrificing his own soul to protect his people. "They call you the Beast of the North," she said softly, stopping just a few feet away from his towering frame. "They say you are a creature of pure malice, incapable of mercy." He closed his eyes, his massive chest rising and falling heavily beneath the thin linen. "I am whatever I needed to be to keep the kingdom safe, even if it meant being despised by the very people I swore to protect." She shook her head, a single tear slipping free and tracking warmly down her pale cheek. She reached out, her trembling hand hovering just inches from his chest, where his heart beat with a slow, agonizing rhythm. The somatic heat of the fated mate bond flared aggressively between them, a desperate, undeniable warmth that sought to heal the deep, jagged wounds of his past. "You let them believe a lie," she whispered, her voice thick with raw emotion. "Because monsters do not kneel to speak to children. Because monsters do not isolate themselves for a century to keep their people safe. Because monsters do not look at me the way you do." He exhaled a shattered, ragged breath. He slowly opened his eyes, and the burning, molten gold of his irises was completely bare, stripped of every defensive wall he had built over a century of solitary agony. He slowly sank to his knees right there on the dusty rug, his massive frame folding in an absolute tearful physical submission at the feet of the outcast girl. He pressed his forehead gently against the hem of her silver gown, his broad shoulders shaking with the sheer force of his suppressed emotion. It was a silent, weeping plea for the one thing he had denied himself his entire life: the right to be loved without destroying the world around him. 2 months had passed since the night. Callan Vance wept at her feet, yet the morning sun offered no real warmth to the towering obsidian walls of Ironfall Keep. The profound emotional vulnerability of that fateful night still lingered, a phantom, heat ghosting across Seren Vantrell's skin whenever she closed her eyes. But the sprawling fortress itself felt dangerously hollow. Over those agonizing weeks, Rowena Thorne had orchestrated a quiet, insidious coup within the shadowed corridors. The ambitious matriarch had ruthlessly poisoned the Sunborn elixir, the rare golden medicine formulated by Orson Cole that actively kept the king alive. Seren watched in helpless terror as Callan's elemental ice curse rapidly accelerated. She felt his agonizing pain bleeding through their invisible bond, his physical decay hidden meticulously behind a mask of stoic sovereignty whenever he addressed the assembled court. To ensure compliance and prevent Seren from exposing the treason, Rowena delivered a chilling ultimatum in the royal healer's study. She used Gemma's safety as absolute leverage, promising her innocent sister would suffer the lethal consequences of any defiance, effectively forcing Seren's desperate silence. It was under these desperate, high-stakes conditions that the Alpha King rode out before dawn with the main host of the royal army. A sudden build-up of hostile forces had been detected along the jagged southern ridge, a coordinated distraction orchestrated by the matriarch's banished loyalists. Callan took the vanguard to crush the insurrection before it could threaten the vulnerable civilian settlements in the valley. In his absence, the heavy silence of the stronghold pressed down on her lungs like a physical weight. The metallic seal binding her to the king throbbed with a dull ache. The somatic tether binding their souls stretched across the frozen miles, feeding her rhythmic echoes of his battle-hardened focus. He was fighting a war on her behalf, while slowly dying from the inside out. The brutal irony of their situation was not lost on her. She had finally found the one place she belonged, only to watch it crumble around them. She was standing in the lower courtyard, wrapped tightly in a heavy cloak of dark wool, watching the Omega servants gather the day's firewood. The winter air was biting, carrying the sharp scent of impending snow and wood smoke. The keep's most vulnerable residents, the elderly, the healers, and the young lichen pups, whose parents had marched with the sovereign, were clustered near the kitchens, seeking whatever warmth the massive iron stoves could provide against the encroaching frost. The children chased each other through the snow, their laughter ringing out in stark contrast to the grim reality closing in. They were unaware of the political tensions and poisonous betrayals threatening to tear the territory apart. The outcast watched a small girl with bright silver hair laugh as she packed a snowball. Seren's heart ached with a fierce, sudden protectiveness that had nothing to do with her sister and everything to do with this pack. They were her people now, even if they did not know it yet. Then the heavy bronze warding bells began to toll. The sound was frantic and chaotic, instantly shattering the quiet peace of the morning. It was not a drill. A massive, coordinated howl erupted from the dense pine forest just beyond the perimeter, a sound so feral and corrupted, it made the blood in her veins run ice-cold. These were not rival soldiers seeking a political coup. They were rogue frostwolves, massive, rabid beasts consumed by the darkest edges of the winter magic, driven mad by the freezing rot the king had spent his life fighting to contain. The creatures had bypassed the main army, slipping silently through unguarded mountain passes to strike directly at the unprotected heart of the kingdom. The heavy timber of the outer gates groaned under a sudden, catastrophic impact. The ancient wood splintered with a sickening crack that echoed like a shattering glacier across the courtyard, and a dark, swirling mist poured violently into the sanctuary. Behind the freezing mist came the monsters. They were terrifying anomalies of nature, their matted white fur coated in jagged ice, their muscles bulging with unnatural strength. Their eyes were milked over with a rabid, mindless frenzy. Panic erupted instantly. The courtyard devolved into visceral chaos. Servants screamed in sheer terror, dropping heavy bundles of wood and scattering in every direction as the first wave of corrupted beasts lunged forward. "To the inner keep! Move!" The commanding roar belonged to Devon Mercer. The stoic guard commander threw himself directly into the path of the oncoming assault, flanked by the few remaining sentries left behind to defend the stone walls. Devon fought with brutal, unyielding discipline. His broadsword became a blinding blur of lethal silver, driving the rabid attackers back from the retreating civilians to create a desperate bottleneck. The harsh clash of heavy steel against unnatural, frozen bone rang out sharply across the freezing courtyard, the frigid air growing heavy with the overwhelming olfactory tang of winter rot and feral musk. Seren did not freeze in terror. The brutal years spent surviving the impoverished fringes of the southern territories had forged her into a creature of pure survival. She sprinted directly toward the kitchen steps, her arms waving frantically as she gathered the terrified, weeping children. She pulled a sobbing pup with soft ears against her hip, shielding his fragile body beneath the thick folds of her heavy woolen cloak. She had once told her sister that they were small things in a world of teeth, and smallness was a gift to be used for hiding. But today, hiding was not an option. Today, she had to become the teeth. "Stay together! Do not let go of my hand!" she shouted, her voice cutting sharply through the deafening roar of the slaughter. She shoved the frightened Omegas toward the heavy oak doors of the inner sanctum, acting as an unyielding physical barrier between the vulnerable pack members and the encroaching danger. A massive, concussive crash echoed to her right. She spun around just in time to see the defensive line overwhelmed. A rogue beast, easily twice the size of a standard Lycan warrior, lunged past the commander's guard. The monster's immense weight slammed into Devon Mercer, violently shattering his defensive stance. The stoic warrior let out a grunt of raw, breathless agony, falling heavily against a frozen stone pillar. His broadsword slipped from his numb grasp, clattering uselessly to the icy ground as his strength rapidly faded beneath the crushing impact of the monstrous assault. "Commander!" the dark-haired girl screamed, abandoning her own safety as she rushed toward the wounded man. She slid to her knees on the slick, treacherous ice, grabbing his uninjured arm to drag his heavy frame backward, desperately pulling him away from the snapping, ice-coated jaws of the advancing beast. Another brave sentry stepped in, striking a heavy blow against the monstrous beast with an iron halberd, giving them a fleeting second of cover. Devon was deathly pale, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as he slumped heavily against the rough stone wall. His armor was dented and coated in a thick layer of frost from the beast's unnatural aura. He reached into the heavy leather pouch at his belt with a violently trembling hand. He pulled out the vault iron key. It was a massive, ancient piece of forged metal, smelling strongly of oxidized iron, damp earth, and generations of royal secrets. It was heavy enough to serve as a bludgeoning weapon itself. "The lower catacombs," the wounded guard gasped, pressing the freezing metal violently into her collused palm. "Take the pups. Lock the reinforced doors from the inside. Do not open them. For anyone but the Sovereign. I cannot just leave you here on the stones," she pleaded, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she clutched the heavy key. The fallen Lycan grabbed the front of her silver gown, his gaze burning with fierce duty. "You are the king's true mate. You are the heart of this keep now. Protect the future of the pack. Go." He pushed her away with the last of his fading strength, forcing himself back to his feet with a terrifying roar of pure defiance. He snatched a discarded, heavy battle-axe from the snow and charged directly back into the surging tide of frost wolves. He was willing to lay down his life in a brave sacrifice to buy her the second she desperately needed. The young woman closed her fist tightly around the freezing metal of the key. She turned and ran back to the terrified huddle of children and unarmed servants. The mystical signet etched into her skin burned with a searing, white-hot intensity, a somatic alarm bell screaming through her nervous system. Kalin could feel her sheer terror. Miles away in the southern pass, the Alpha King was undoubtedly turning his massive army around, his own heart consumed by a blind panic. But he would never arrive in time to stop the horrors breaching his walls. She was on her own. "Follow me. Down the stairs, quickly," she ordered, her voice devoid of the quiet, submissive hesitation that had defined her past. She herded the sobbing group of 30 children and elders through the winding, dimly torchlit corridors of the keep. They descended rapidly into the subterranean depths, leaving the horrific sounds of the chaotic battle echoing faintly above them. The air grew immediately damp and aggressively stale, smelling of ancient dust, crushed stone, and the deep earth. The narrow spiral staircase seemed to stretch on forever, the flickering shadows dancing wildly against the raw granite walls, mocking their desperate flight for survival. They finally reached the bottom of the fortress. Looming before them in the oppressive gloom were the massive, heavily reinforced doors of the ancient stone vaults. The entryway was flanked by solid, unyielding rock, built centuries ago by the first rulers of Valdris to withstand a full-scale magical siege. Seren shoved the heavy iron key into the rusted lock, her hands shaking so violently she could barely turn the massive mechanism. With a deafening metallic clank, the internal tumblers shifted. She threw her full body weight against the heavy oak, pushing the door open just wide enough for the terrified group to squeeze inside. Once the last weeping child was clear of the threshold, She dragged the heavy door shut, throwing the massive iron deadbolts into place with a resounding, finalizing thud. The darkness of the vault was immediately oppressive, broken only by the faint light of a single melted candle resting on a nearby stone alcove. The space was cavernous, a vast subterranean chamber carved directly into the very foundation of the mountain itself. In the center of the room stood a towering ancient monument of stone covered in worn, incomprehensible ancestral runes. The children huddled tightly together at the base of the massive pillar, their small trembling bodies pressing desperately against the cold rock for any semblance of comfort. Seren stood near the locked doors, her chest heaving as she listened to the terrifying, suffocating silence of the catacombs. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the room was the ragged, fearful breathing of the pups, and the distant, muffled thumps vibrating from the stone ceiling above. She pressed her back flat against the thick wood, the icy metal of the deadbolt biting sharply into her spine, praying to the ancestors that the heavy timber would hold. She could hear the faint whimpering cries of the children echoing in the massive cavern, their small hands gripping the fabric of her cloak as they sought shelter in the dark. Then, the heavy oak door shuddered. It was not a knock, it was a massive concussive impact that shook a thick layer of dust from the vaulted ceiling. The children screamed in unison, covering their sensitive ears as the terrifying, high-pitched sound of jagged claws, scraping violently against iron, filled the small, enclosed space. The rogue beasts had caught her unique scent. They had bypassed the guards in the courtyard and tracked their vulnerable prey straight down into the very depths of the keep. Boom! The heavy reinforced door buckled inward, the thick iron hinges groaning in agonizing metallic protest. The ancient wood began to splinter under the sheer force of the assault, unable to withstand the relentless physical strength of the corrupted frost wolves. The outcast backed away slowly, her eyes wide with visceral, paralyzing terror. There was nowhere left to run. They were cornered in the dark, trapped in a stone cage with mindless monsters tearing at the only exit. The desperate, maternal instinct swelling in her chest expanded into a crushing physical pressure that eclipsed her fear. Because when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned, something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me. The silent, fierce vow echoed in her mind. She would not let these innocent children be slaughtered in the dark. She would not let the future of her mate's kingdom die on her watch. With a horrific crack, the massive wooden doors gave way. The heavy iron bolts tore free from the stone frame, and the whole structure collapsed inward in a blinding cloud of splintered wood and choking dust. Through the ruined entryway stepped a monster pulled straight from a waking nightmare. The alpha of the rogue pack was gargantuan, its emaciated, frost-covered body filling the massive doorway. Frost emanated from its jagged jaws, freezing the stone floor with a violent, crackling sizzle. Its milky, rabid eyes locked instantly onto the cluster of terrified children huddled at the base of the ancient monument. The beast let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated straight through the soles of her feet, its powerful hind legs bunching as it prepared to lunge forward into the defenseless crowd. She did not retreat. She threw herself directly into the path of the massive creature, placing her fragile human body squarely between the rabid monster and the weeping pups, her arms spread wide in a final defiant gesture of protection. The beast snapped its terrifying jaws, lunging forward with blinding lethal speed. But as the monster moved, the intricate silver lattice on her wrist exploded with a blinding, incandescent light. The deep, somatic connection she shared with the Alpha King reached its critical peak, acting as a cosmic catalyst for the dormant power sleeping heavily within her veins. It was the Sunborn fire answering her desperate, unspoken plea for survival. The deep, subterranean environment of the ancient catacombs was instantly flooded with a fierce celestial heat. Her suppressed cosmic lineage, tied to the very stars and solar fire of her ancestors, woke up with a devastating, radiant fury. Seren slammed both of her bare, corlused palms forward, aiming her surging energy directly toward the advancing Frostwolf. A massive shockwave of blinding, white-hot solar energy erupted violently from her skin. The raw, elemental power was overwhelming, a terrifying, beautiful manifestation of celestial gold fire and intense cosmic heat that defied the icy rot. The radiant blast struck the corrupted beasts with the force of a supernova. The solid granite floor of the vault groaned under the sudden, searing temperature spike that drowned out the monster's feral snarls. The rogue alpha tried frantically to scramble backward as the intense heat instantly began to vaporize that jagged ice coating its body, but it was far too late to escape the wrath of a sovereign queen defending her pack. With a deafening, catastrophic roar, the blazing wave of sunborn fire consumed the massive beast. The molten white-gold flames expanded outward in a concussive blast, driving the corrupted wolves backward through the ruined entryway. The intense cosmic heat melted the encroaching frost in seconds, incinerating the rabid anomalies into harmless ash. The secondary wolves crowding the narrow hallway behind their alpha were instantly vaporized as the blazing solar energy flooded the corridor, creating an impenetrable wall of radiant fire that sealed the breach. The sheer, devastating force of the sunborn magic cleansed the threshold, replacing the splintered wooden doors with a blazing, molten barrier of residual celestial heat that locked the remaining threat out forever. The violent conflagration ceased just as abruptly as it had begun. The heavy, choking ash slowly began to settle in the ringing silence of the vault. The terrifying, feral growls of the rabid beasts were gone, replaced only by the soft, staggered breathing of the surviving children, and the faint, settling crackle of the newly forged scorch marks on the stone walls. Seren stood trembling before the ancient monument, her chest heaving as the blinding golden light slowly faded from her pale fingertips. Her legs finally gave out, drained by the massive expenditure of cosmic energy. She collapsed onto her knees on the cold, intact stone, gasping desperately for air. The glowing silver bond on her arm continued to throb with a steady, fierce heat, a beautiful somatic promise that Kalin had felt every single second of her terrifying, sovereign awakening. The lowly, invisible outcast had not just survived the dark. She had commanded the blazing solar fire of her ancestors to rise up and defend the kingdom. She was no longer just a hidden mate or a political hostage. In the frozen, shattered depths of the ancient catacombs, Seren Vantrell had finally embraced her true destiny, and the world would never be the same again. The oppressive darkness of the subterranean catacombs was entirely gone, replaced by a lingering, radiant warmth that felt like the gentle embrace of a midsummer afternoon. Seren Vantrell remained on her knees upon the solid granite floor, her chest rising and falling in slow, exhausted rhythms as the last remnants of the blinding golden light faded from her fingertips. The air inside the ancient vault smelled strongly of scorched ozone, settling ash, and the faint, comforting scent of blooming wildflowers, a bizarre olfactory anomaly in the heart of a frozen fortress. The heavy vault iron key, which Devon Mersus had entrusted to her, hung safely at her hip, now completely unnecessary. The violent threat of the rogue pack had been entirely erased by the sheer magnitude of her sunborn magic. All that remained of the massive, rabid alpha and its corrupted followers were dark, cooling scorch marks etched deeply into the stone walls, serving as a permanent testament to the newly awakened power of the true queen. The young children, who had been huddled in absolute terror at the base of the towering ancestral monument, began to stir. The suffocating silence that followed the catastrophic blast was finally broken by a soft, hesitant whimper. The outcast forced her trembling, calloused hands to push against the cold stone, ignoring the profound physical ache vibrating through her bones. She crawled slowly toward the cluster of weeping pups, her heavy woolen cloak dragging across the dusty floor. A small, fragile girl with bright silver hair threw herself forward, burying her tear-streaked face into the crook of the heroine's neck. Seren wrapped her arms fiercely around the child, rocking her back and forth with a deep, maternal tenderness that completely defied the apocalyptic violence she had just unleashed. "You are safe now," she whispered, her voice raw and scratching against her dry throat. "The monsters are gone. You are completely safe." The magical silver pact mark binding them had finally stopped its agonizing, frantic burning. Instead of a searing alarm, the intricate metallic lattice now pulsed with a steady, profound warmth. The somatic connection was feeding her an overwhelming wave of sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from the other side of the bond. But it was not her own fear. It was the frantic, devastating terror of the Alpha King. Calen Vance was rushing back to the Citadel, his emotional state bleeding across the miles, a chaotic storm of absolute desperation and blinding rage. He had felt the massive surge of her cosmic energy. He knew the inner sanctum had been breached, and he was tearing the world apart to reach her. The heavy bronze warding bells, echoing from the upper levels, abruptly ceased their frantic tolling. A new sound reverberated through the thick stone ceiling, the thunderous, coordinated march of armored boots, and the sharp, disciplined shouts of the returning royal vanguard. The sovereign had abandoned the southern ridge the moment he felt her terror through the tether, riding his forces to the brink of exhaustion to reclaim his home. For several tense, agonizing minutes, the survivors in the vault held their collective breath. Then, the distinct sound of heavy, desperate footsteps echoed violently down the winding spiral staircase. The footfalls were erratic, skipping stone steps in a reckless, frantic descent. Whoever was coming down the dark corridor was completely unconcerned with stealth or safety. A massive silhouette appeared in the ruined, splintered entryway of the catacombs. Calen stood in the shattered threshold, his imposing frame outlined by the flickering light of the corridor torches. The ruler looked entirely devastated. His blackened steel armor was heavily dented and covered in a thick layer of soot and fresh blood. In his left hand, he gripped a heavy iron shield. The defensive armament, forged from reinforced iron, was completely fractured down the middle. A stark physical representation of the brutal, frantic violence he had carved through to reach the lower levels of the keep. The cursed man's chest heaved with ragged, shallow gasps. The volatile depths of his silver gaze were wild, darting frantically around the cavernous chamber before locking onto the glowing, molten barrier of residual celestial heat that still partially blocked the doorway. The moment his gaze found the dark-haired girl sitting on the floor with the children, the terrifying, feral panic in his expression shattered into absolute, overwhelming relief. Seren gently released the silver-haired pup, signaling the children to stay back, and slowly pushed herself to her feet. As she stood, she consciously drew the lingering solar energy back into her veins. The blazing, molten barrier of sunborn fire, blocking the entryway, instantly dissipated into thin air, leaving the path completely clear. He did not hesitate. The terrifying conqueror of the north dropped the fractured iron shield, the heavy metal hitting the granite floor with a resounding, hollow clatter that echoed through the vast chamber. He crossed the distance between them in 3 massive strides, entirely ignoring the deep scorch marks and the lingering scent of vaporized ash. The sheer physical size of him was normally intimidating, but in this singular moment, he projected nothing but absolute, naked vulnerability. He stopped mere inches from her, his massive hands trembling violently as they hovered in the air, seemingly terrified that touching her might break an illusion. The thick layer of jagged, magical frost that usually coated his skin had receded dramatically, beaten back by the sheer proximity to her awakened warmth. "I felt your terror," the sovereign breathed, his voice breaking in a way that no member of his court had ever witnessed. I felt the bond screaming. I thought I had lost you to the ice. She looked up into his face, seeing the deep, agonizing lines of exhaustion and chronic pain etched around his eyes. He had ridden into battle while dying from an ancestral curse, all to protect the kingdom she had just saved. The profound irony of their situation wrapped around her heart. She reached out, her small, pale fingers gently brushing the soot-stained edge of his jaw. The physical contact sent a beautiful, soothing wave of somatic heat directly into his freezing flesh. Callan exhaled a shattered, ragged sigh, leaning heavily into her delicate touch. The beast within him completely surrendered to the quiet, resilient woman who had defended his future. He did not pull her into a desperate embrace or assert his dominance. Instead, the most feared ruler in the three realms slowly sank to his knees on the hard stone floor, right in front of the watchful eyes of the terrified children. The heavy frost-cold chain draped over his shoulders clinked softly as he bowed his head, pressing his freezing forehead gently against the center of her stomach. His broad shoulders shook as the massive, unyielding wall of his emotional isolation finally collapsed. He wept silently, a quiet, devastating release of a century's worth of loneliness, pain, and the overwhelming realization that he had finally found his true equal. "You saved them," he murmured against the fabric of her gown, his voice thick with raw emotion. "You commanded the fire of the ancestors and saved my pack when I could not. You are the true sovereign of this keep." Seren stroked his dark hair, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective devotion. "They are my people too. I would never, ever let the monsters take them." He tilted his head back, looking up at her with eyes that burned with a brilliant molten gold. "I was a monster to you. I dragged you into my darkness, forced a bargain upon you, and bound you to my side to satisfy my own desperate, dying soul. I wanted to protect you, but I only brought the war to your doorstep." She shook her head slowly, a soft, understanding smile touching her lips. The initial terror and resentment that had defined their first meeting in the throne room felt like a distant, faded memory. The man kneeling before her was not a tyrant. He was a deeply broken protector who had sacrificed his own life to contain a lethal rot. "You are not a monster," she replied softly, her voice carrying an absolute, unwavering certainty that echoed through the silent vault. A true fiend would never kneel to speak to children. A ruthless beast wouldn't isolate itself for a century to keep its kingdom safe, and a monster could never look at me the way you do. Callan closed his eyes, a single tear cutting a clean path through the soot on his cheek. "I release you from the Obsidian Treaty. I release you from the hostage bargain. You owe me absolutely nothing. But if you will have me, if you will truly accept this cursed, broken beast, I ask for your consent to claim you, not as a prisoner, but as my fated mate, my equal, and the only queen I will ever serve." The absolute sincerity of his plea hung in the warm air of the catacombs, stripping away the final layers of doubt that had guarded her heart for a lifetime. Seren looked down at the massive, powerful sovereign kneeling in submission, recognizing the profound weight of the choice he was offering. He was returning her agency, placing the ultimate power over their shared destiny entirely in her collused hands. She did not need to run or hide in the shadows anymore. She had found a man who valued her quiet strength, a protector who would burn the world to keep her safe, yet still recognized her supreme sovereignty. "I accept you, Callan," she whispered, her voice clear and resolute. "I choose this bond, I choose you." The moment the words left her lips, the silver lattice on her wrist flared with a blinding, incandescent brilliance. It was no longer a unilateral brand of captivity. It became a true, synchronized conduit of fated magic. Seren placed both of her hands squarely against the cold steel of his chest armor, right over his struggling, frozen heart. She did not hold back. She willingly opened the floodgates of her dormant lineage, allowing the immense celestial heat of her ancestors to pour directly into the king's body. The somatic transfer was devastatingly beautiful, A massive shockwave of radiant, golden fire erupted between them, completely engulfing his imposing frame. The elemental ice curse, which had ravaged his bloodline for generations, fought back with a violent, freezing screech. But the winter rot was absolutely no match for the willing, consensual offering of a supreme cosmic mate. The jagged, black frost encasing his veins instantly flash-boiled into white steam. The deep, bruised blue coloring of his skin faded rapidly, replaced by the healthy, vibrant flush of rushing blood. The lunar crest amulet resting against her collarbone hummed with residual celestial energy, vibrating in perfect harmony with the newfound warmth. The frost-cold chain, the enchanted glacial restraint he had worn for decades to suppress his lethal magic, suddenly cracked. With a sharp, ringing snap, the mystical ice shattered entirely, the heavy links falling away from his shoulders and clattering uselessly against the granite floor. The agonizing void within his soul was finally filled, the endless winter within his chest, completely thawed by the blazing summer of her love. Callan gasped, taking his first truly deep, painless breath in over a century. The crushing pressure in his lungs was gone. He was entirely healed. He rose slowly to his feet, pulling her effortlessly into his arms. The brutal cold that had always defined his aura was completely replaced by a radiating, comforting warmth. When he kissed her, it was not the desperate, frantic claim of a beast, but a deep, reverent promise of absolute devotion. The fated mate bond snapped permanently into place, an unbreakable cosmic tether that anchored their souls together in perfect harmony. 3 days later, the grand dining hall of Ironfall Keep hosted a very different kind of gathering. The oppressive, freezing gloom that had long characterized the fortress was completely gone. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, catching the dust motes in the warm, comfortable air. Kaelin and Seren sat side by side at the head of the massive mahogany table, their chairs identical in height and status. The king wore no armor, his relaxed posture projecting a calm, unassailable authority that required no intimidation to enforce. Standing before the royal dais, stripped of her fine crimson silk and heavy jewels, was Rowena Thorne. The scheming dynastic matriarch had been dragged from her chambers by the surviving elite guards. Her plot to poison the Sunborn elixir and coordinate the rogue attack had been thoroughly exposed by Orson Cole, who had recovered the tainted vials from the lower apse and matched them to forbidden texts in the ancient grimoire. The treacherous noblewoman looked pale and terrified, the sweet scent of gardenia entirely replaced by the sour stench of absolute defeat. Treason against the crown and the deliberate endangerment of the Pack's children, Callan announced, his voice devoid of anger, but carrying a chilling, absolute finality. Your ambition almost destroyed this kingdom from the inside out. Mercy, my king, the matriarch begged, dropping to her knees on the polished obsidian floor, her previous arrogance completely shattered. I was only thinking of the strength of the territory. I did not know the rogue beasts would breach the inner walls. The Alpha King did not even glance at the weeping traitor. He turned his head, looking to the quiet, dark-haired woman sitting beside him, explicitly deferring the judgment of the court to his queen. It was a massive, public display of shared sovereignty that left the assembled aristocracy in stunned silence. Seren looked down at the woman who had mocked her fragile lineage just days prior. She felt no need for violent revenge, only a profound desire to permanently excise the poison from her new home. You are stripped of all titles, lands, and wealth, the heroine declared, her voice steady and echoing with undeniable authority. You are permanently banished from the Northern Territories. If you ever cross our borders again, you will not face the king's mercy. You will face my fire. Remove her. The guards stepped forward instantly, dragging the screaming traitor from the hall. The absolute poetic justice of the moment settled over the court, permanently establishing the new hierarchy. The untouchable elite had been cast out, and the invisible outcast now ruled the realm. The heavy double doors of the hall swung open once more, but this time it was not a prisoner entering. A radiant, warm smile broke across Seren's face as she immediately stood from her chair. Escorted by Devon Mercer, the recovering guard commander, Gemma Vantrell stepped hesitantly into the sunlight. The fragile young girl was completely safe, having been rushed back to the capital in a royal carriage the moment the rogue threat was neutralized. "Seren," the teenager cried, hiking up the skirts of her thick traveling dress as she ran across the long room. The sisters collided in a fierce, desperate embrace, tears of absolute joy streaming down their faces. The terrifying, agonizing separation that had initiated this entire journey was finally over. The deal she had struck, offering herself as a prisoner in exchange for her sister's safe passage, had evolved into something far more profound. Gemma was not just a rescued hostage anymore. She was officially welcomed into the royal household, placed under the absolute protection of the crown, and guaranteed a life of luxury and safety she had never dared to imagine. Callan watched the reunion with a soft, affectionate smile, his molten gold eyes reflecting the deep peace that had finally settled over his fractured soul. Later that afternoon, the royal couple walked together through the central courtyard. The transformation of the fortress was nothing short of miraculous. Without the elemental curse aggressively suppressing the environment, the ambient magic of the keep had normalized. The thick, perpetual layers of jagged frost were rapidly melting away, revealing the ancient, dark stone beneath. The biting winter winds had softened into a gentle, cool breeze carrying the distinct, earthy scent of damp soil and impending growth. They stopped near the center of the gardens, where a massive, ancient stone fountain had been frozen solid for generations. Now, crystal-clear water bubbled happily over the edges, catching the golden light of the late afternoon sun. Kaelin reached into the recently thawed soil near the base of the fountain. With incredible gentleness, his massive fingers plucked a single, vibrant bloom that had miraculously survived beneath the ice. He turned and presented the delicate flower to his mate. It was a thawed rose, its deep red petals rimmed with a faint, shimmering hint of residual frost that was rapidly melting into dew. It was a beautiful, physical manifestation of the broken curse, a symbol of life stubbornly returning to a dead world. Seren accepted the offering, her collused fingers brushing against his warm skin. She looked up at the towering, terrifying beast of the north, seeing only the gentle, fiercely devoted man who had yielded his entire world to keep her safe. The agonizing trials of her past, the grinding poverty, the desperate sacrifices, the crushing fear of being invisible and discarded, were entirely washed away by the absolute certainty of his love. They had started as a desperate bargain in a freezing throne room, a tragic collision of a doomed ruler and a selfless sister. But from that dark, transactional beginning, they had forged a bond that shattered curses and burned away the winter rot. The silent, resilient outcast had not just survived the storm. She had become the sun that thawed the frozen kingdom. As Callan wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest in the warm, blooming courtyard, the ancient rumors of the Valdris bloodline finally felt complete. No woman lasted a night with him, they had whispered in the dark corners of the taverns. But one woman did. One woman lasted a lifetime.